So I think now we can go now into the questions and answers section. I think possibly those who would like to ask a question, they could raise their hand. But since we're quite around 67 participants, it may take a longer time for you to be recognized. You know how difficult it is in Zoom meetings. Perhaps a better thing to do is just to put your questions on the chat box and put the name of the person you want to ask the question to, and JC and I will read out the questions and direct it to the speakers. But if you want to say it personally, orally, your question, you just raise your hand. Yeah. Okay. We can start the question. So yeah, who would like to ask the first question?
Ben, I think there's a question in the chat.
Yeah. But I can't see it on my end. Yeah. So, Daisy, can you see that? No, I can't see it here. I don't know why.
Nakalabas.
Oh.
I think you asked the admin how to open that.
I can read it for everyone.
Okay. JC, can you see it? Yung question QA? I don't see the QA, but Kaloy can.
I can see it. It's here.
Okay.
So from Earl Echel Caraga to everyone. In science, citizenship, and the prospect of the public bringing a lot of information, both in urban and non-urban areas, in social media, it is also important to note the age groups who interact with the posts. Do more middle-aged to old people interact than young people, and what it could entail to the online community?
Yes, I agree with you, Earl. It's also included in the study for insights. You can look at it also as a page admin, for example. But I noticed that many middle-aged individuals are very active in posting, asking for identification, while the younger individuals are more into helping identification. They readily post their comments immediately, giving feedback, trying out to provide hypotheses, so they get to interact with one another. We're still at the starting phase of this kasi, again, this is just a passion project, a hobby. And while following the discussion with Dr. Isip Tan in a previous PAASE webinar also, we realized that we have to take this seriously, looking at insights, what time, what ages. So far, with age distribution, we have a 50-50 representation between males and females. Most of them are middle-aged. And again, their activities is around 11 a.m. While the younger ones, they're more active around 9 p.m. to 11 p.m.
Other questions?
Yeah, there's a question from Miss Leticia Afwang. Okay, she would like to say it. Yeah. I give the floor to Miss Afwang. Are you here?
Hello. Yeah. Am I heard? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. I just wonder, since most of you have gone to museums, international museums that we know are of high quality, and we also recognize the very great value of museums, especially in upholding historical biological data. It goes beyond ages. How would you rate the status of Philippine museums in relation or compared to the rest of the other museums? And how could we improve, or what action should we do so that we can come at par with the rest of the international museums that we know of?
Okay, that's a good question. Let me answer a few something about that. I think it starts with our basic education, and because our teachers would have to be more oriented to what a museum really is, because I have known I get students in college when we talk about visiting museums, whether it's for fine arts or anthropology or natural history. The 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 view is that the museum is just a storehouse for all of these objects, and sometimes if they see it once and that's it. So I think one of the biggest challenges really is to make it an ongoing engagement. Maybe I see that the new normal provides certain opportunities, but the thing is, again, it may not be available for everyone, especially because internet connections are not yet democratized in our country. But still, that continuing engagement will be a major challenge. Whether museums are reopened, it will be reopened, but perhaps with reduced visitor attendance as a public health measure. So we need to increase that engagement. So maybe Dr. Dupos may have something to say about it, in JC.
First. Ladies first.
Sir JC po muna. May sinasagot lang po ako sa chat.
Okay, JC.
So it's a little different with natural history museums because a lot of people go in and it's part of the education system. We also, actually, most of our visitors before the museum closed are medyo young audience. Of course, 10 pesos, karamihan naman, rather than 20 pesos entrance fee. But it's amazing because we still have, even though there's the new National Museum of Natural History, which is open to the public now from the National Museum system, we still get a lot of visitors from last year. So I think it's a different thing na marami na engage with natural history and sports. It's everything you see around you. But also different with university museums because they are effectively used as support to teaching collections. So talagang mas gamit po yung from university museums as being connected to that. I hope I was able to answer. So, Ma'am Dupo.
Okay, so apart from MNH, for example, being a university museum, malaki yung nakikita natin in terms of our function for engaging people, but not on the conventional manner. Kasi po, my first job actually in the university, second job, was to serve as an extensionist for the museum. So I saw the transition between people looking at static exhibits and now people are wanting more. So when they go back, the first feedback that they have with me is, wala bang bago? And now we're moving on to the task that maybe the museum is not just the exhibit, rather the curators, the staff, the research are actually museums also providing information to the people straightforward, but not in a scientific manner, rather in a way that we can converse with them just as we are conversing with colleagues, our students. So it's pretty dynamic, but you cannot draw the lines between where the museum starts and where the museum ends. Dati nga, our first impression of a museum was that most of the exhibits are dead. But now we're working on a live museum, giving more importance to observations in natural history. Kasi nga, we also have an academic complement. So I think those are what I see to be movements in the future.
I agree. Thank you po. Next question. I'm sorry.
Well, I'd like to read a message from Professor Emeritus Giselle Concepcion. So congratulations to Professor Concepcion for being designated as Emeritus Professor at UP. So he encouraged us to join forces with national scientist Lourdes Cruz, who is an advocate of science citizenship or citizen science. Because I think we are all now dedicated to it. So it's a challenge from Emeritus Professor Giselle Concepcion, who's also the president of PAASE.
Thank you, Benji. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome, Giselle. So, and do you have any, there's another question. Now, this is a question for Dr. Michelle Eusebio from Mr. Agustin Doronila. Did you look at the phytoliths as a way of discriminating the rice varieties? You're in mute late. Michelle, you're on mute. Unmute. Okay, yeah.
No, I don't specialize in phytoliths. So in relation to the Ifugo Archaeological Project, they had someone who specializes on phytoliths. I think it's Dr. Michael Horrocks. Yeah, they also publish on that. So as an archaeologist, I'm only aware of phytoliths can separate. Examining phytoliths can separate up to genus or species level. Not yet. For the varieties, I don't know. So.
Thank you, Paul. We have another question. Thank you, Ma'am Eusebio. So we have a question from Dr. Huang. Can we achieve global significance through virtual exhibits? And are we capacitated to do this? I think that's my question because I talked about the virtual museum. So we have a virtual tour at the Museum of Natural History. It's a little different because you have to access an application to do that. The one that I showed you was the one from YouTube. The one on YouTube is a little fuzzy, so you need a special the VR goggles to see that. So it's a virtual VR tool that you look into virtual chat. So medyo na para siyang 3D. There are other applications that are available elsewhere, but it's very limited because it's just a set of images that are brought into the virtual environment. So hindi siya gumagalaw, they're mostly static. Ikaw yung gumagalaw within the virtual environment. So for those who have done VR, so may limitations talaga siya. I think whatever you put, but because it's all computer generated, you can always change. Probably mas malinis ang itsura na itong museum if you have it there. So it will vary depending on the system that you use. Are we capacitated? I think we are. It is an existing program. There's a lot of people who are very much into computer generation. A lot of new applications are even available for us. Dati dapat talagang specialist ang gumagawa yan. Ngayon, you can see that people can do a lot of things on IG. Just download an app. Convert your picture to art. Gusto mo maging Andy Warhol, yung itsura mo na picture mo? Just get this app. It must be an application. There's an application. You can change that. And then, without even handling paint or anything, can change. So yes, depending on what application it will be used, then you can achieve that in terms of. Again, it's all online. It's very limited, but it's still very useful. And thank you, Mama Fang. Anyone would have an answer as well from the panel. Here you go. May response po
Ako si Sir Lit din. Actually po, capacity-wise, I don't think we are in short of that. Passion-wise, we are very much with energy. Infrastructure po siguro. But Sir JC is correct in that na we only need to say that we want to do it for us to be able to do it. Kasi kahit naman po gaano tayo ka-high-tech, it all boils down if we want to do it. Not just the need. Kasi being global doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be high-tech on this. Kasi everything that I have shared for you this morning were actually made in my home. So you can share information globally through social media without additional funds. Most of the specimens I have shared because I'm at home are just in my small garden, but yet you can readily do that. So having a virtual exhibit is no different as wanting something new. So it can be done. Ang kulang na lang po talaga is infrastructure support. Kasi yun po yung complex doon. And I think the museum has just received funding for digitization of biological specimens through Mr. Jeremy Naredo. So it's a start. But it cannot happen overnight. Paunti-unti pa rin po siya.
Okay. Other panels? So we'll go on to the, thank you, Ma'am Dupo. We'll go on to I think there's another question from Kit Milacantara. How could you picture museology 10 years from now? And what would be the possible advancements of integrating curation and handling of important biological artifacts. Ma'am Dupo, would you like to start on that?
Siguro, it's something more of developing a respect for the museum, not just static exhibits, but rather a repository of important artifacts, voucher specimens, and also garnering support for our taxonomists who are working very hard to tandem with other scientists to inform the public that this science is constantly changing. So museology, whether you transcend to a more dynamic one, whether it's video or not, it's still establishing that bright-eyed look of the child when coming into the museum. That's when you know you're doing the right job. Kasi pag nakita mo silang fascinated, that means that memory has already been ingrained in their minds. Kasi sa akin, I work with natural history because I had the same fascination for catching spiders. Yung mismong activity of catching a spider in the vial was very critical for me to work in natural sciences. So what more if we can spark that same spark to other kids? So they become our market. So we start them out young. We're working also with the DOST-SEI in developing modules, taking interest in insects, in biology. Ngayon din po, dahil may COVID, videos na lang po ang gagawin natin in the bus, and this will be released through the DepEd. So we don't stop. Even if we don't have the capacity right now, we do not stop. We always find ways. Again, it all boils down to passion. If you want museology to move in the next 10 years, you have to have people with energy and the passion to do it.
Just to add to that, no, how do we see museology? I'm not really a museologist, but as a biogeographer, I did half my time in the museum for my research. Now, this is connected to another question by a comment by Mr. John David Cortez, no, about natural history collections from the Philippines in other countries. Is repatriation of these specimens a good or worthy cause? Now, that is a very politically loaded question. In the arts, the Greeks want the Elgin marbles returned to Greece. But then again, these materials could be global cultural patrimony. So pwede rin naman there's a global scientific patrimony. Now the view now from even when we went to Ferrol in the Natural History Museum, that museum is not really supported by the government of Spain or the regional government in terms of funding. Also, they got although they got a charter from the regional parliament, no. But still, they have to raise their own money as a private foundation. So that is a big challenge for them. But even then, with the little funding that they get, they're trying to digitize and make more global engagement for their collections. And this would connect with the repatriation of the specimens. Let's say from the Monterrey collection. Why don't we just return it to the Philippines, no? I think it's we need to look at it at a global cultural context because scientific collections are cultural patrimony also. Having it in one museum may not be good just in case something happens to our national museum because all our specimens are there. Okay, it's better that some of them would be in museum overseas. But since we are now in a more globalized environment with digital access, everybody, and you can access it digitally, some of the material. And if you need to go there to see it physically, and we should give a system of grants and support for scholars and students in mobility to go from museum to museum. In the European Union, that's quite easy because an EU citizen can go from one EU country without any visa requirements. We still have a problem here. Just to go to Europe, we need to apply visas months in advance. No? So, yeah, it's a question that is that needs to be fully discussed. Maybe we should have agreements with other countries. So the Montero collection, if you ask me, I think would better be remains in Ferrol because the climate is good for its preservation. If we move it to Manila, then we have to invest in a separate section of the National Museum and probably with the climate controls. That's it. And that's my opinion. But we can access this digitally once they complete the digital recording of all the materials at the museum.
Hello. Hi. Hi, JC and Ben. Hello. I'd like to add to what Dr. Dupo mentioned about how to move forward, or what do we do 10 years from now. That like to also answer that question. Dr. Dupo and JC has also answered about the virtual tour, so I will not dwell on that. But I think as far as the research collections are concerned, we really should have one proper building that will secure the museum, not only in terms of disasters, but also securing it against the humid tropical climate, as well as having a proper molecular lab. I know JC has required PCR machine, but a proper molecular lab near the museum collection so that we will lessen the potential harm to specimens. Transporting priceless collections from just one room to the next entails danger. And if we can, for example, getting those toe pads from birds, or a piece of a nail from a specimen, to extract DNA will be much better, much safer if we have our own molecular lab in the museum. And also to go forward to a more comprehensive digitization program, so that not all specimens need to be loaned physically, but maybe through images. So that's what I would like to say for how to go about 10 years from now for museology. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Lit. So would you like to add on the natural history specimens being repatriated?
There are some museums that would like to also, what do you call that, bawasan yung kanilang, they're already lacking in space. But the problem is, are we ready to accept them? For example, the part of the Baker collection, Charles Fuller Baker, one of our first deans in UP College of Agriculture, part of his vast insect collections, part is in the Bernice P. Bishop Museum in Hawaii. The other big part is in the Smithsonian collection in Washington, D.C. And they are willing to give, especially those parts that nobody is working on. The problem is who will finance the transport, and who will be accepting here? I think we are, because that's actually from the College of Agriculture, which is UP Los Baños now. So some are ready, but of course for the others, like the ones in France, the ones in the British Museum, they might not be as ready as the ones in the US.
Thank you, Sir Lit. So yeah, we actually have specimens that have been repatriated to the Philippines. One of the examples is the holotype of the cloud rat from Dinagat. So it is actually part of the collection, or a board collection here in UP Los Baños. So it's been brought back by the Field Museum into the Philippines. We also have the two specimens of the Dinagat gymnor. It's not the holotype, but they're part of the series. I was originally collected by Dr. Moore. So there are examples of specimens that have been repatriated back. Again, it depends on them if they were loaned before. So syempre, babalik yun. or they were brought back into the Philippines by the museums themselves. But because now we also have the heritage law, and the heritage law actually defines that anything collected, especially the holotype, is owned by the Philippines. So if the particular museum that is studying them and brought them back with them has finished studying them, then they have to be repatriated back into the Philippines. Of course, the National Museum would be in the process of accepting that. Dr. Yusabi, you have something to add?
I guess none. Thank you very much.
Additional questions po? Double check. May question po si Ma'am Gisela. Is Stephen Acabado Filipino?
Oh, I think I addressed it here. Yeah, he's a Filipino archaeologist based in University of California, Los Angeles. He published a lot. He even writes recently in Rappler. So he talks about the younger age of Ipuga-Rice terraces as opposed to 2,000-year-old story. And then I think he recently wrote about the Bahay Kubo, the interpretation of the vegetables in the Bahay Kubo and the implications of those vegetables in our history, that they are here because of the Colombian exchange, in relation to the galleon trade. So you can look, you can Google him for his works, a majority about Ifugao terraces.
JC, may I say something? JC?
Yes, po.
If you scroll up, I had a question to Michelle and also to you and Benji, because there's a group of us actually led by Toto Oliveira interested in our Austronesian origin and relation. And of course, we know Taiwan also has it. So of course, we could trace our evolution, our ancestry, just by doing our genetics. And I'm sure there's this kind of studies already from our researchers like Cora de Umbria. But we were thinking also of linking it to agriculture, to our early crops. And so we consulted Michael Purganan about an appropriate crop to follow, perhaps through our Austronesian radiations. And so among those he suggested is gabi, taro. And now Michelle says that taro is older than rice, okay, plantains. And it's Stephen who's been studying it. So thanks a lot, Michelle, for that great lead. But we're also thinking of how we can do studies on taro in early agriculture, together with genetics, human genetics. But also we have this interest, and that's why I found Michelle's talk so interesting, because now she's looking at pottery for the analytes that would give us an idea of the food that they ate and cooked. We're also interested in how taro was being used as a food ingredient, throughout our history until the present time. So this is a kind of an interesting project that you might like to consider, because it's cross-disciplinary, socio-cultural, it's historical, but it would also entail a lot of genetics and chemical analysis, as well as citizen science, because then we're already going to get our RAs very interested in food in different parts of our country, to look at the recipes that make use of taro. Anyway, it's still in the works. We're still trying to conceptualize it, but these kinds of research, I think, they're appropriately linked to the museum. So Museum of Natural History and also of Anthropology. Okay, so thank you for giving me the chance to speak.
Ms. Abby? Thank you, Ma'am Gisela, for anything to add, Ma'am, to that? Ma'am Isabel. So I think keep up.
Well, in relation to the Austronesian migration, because they supposed to, aside from language, they carry with them rice agriculture. So perhaps the best marker would be the rice residues under pottery. Well, rice is kind of tricky because it's mostly carbohydrates. But recently, it seems going to be optimistic because there are the biomarkers for other cereals like wheat and millet. They already discovering it. But if you're familiar with PTME's compounds for the millet and alkyl resorcinols for the wheat. So probably later on, the researchers somewhere in Europe, they'll discover the actual biomarkers for the rice. Well, I suspect it's alkyl resorcinol because rice actually have alkyl resorcinols, but the specifics it's about to yet to be discovered. So yeah, I think the best biomarkers for for the Austronesian migration have something to do with the rice. So hopefully sooner or later there will be an established biomarker for the rice.
Thanks, Michelle. Very, very good.
Well, yeah, would have anything to add in terms of biogeography with those Austronesian origins?
Yeah, I have something to add. About a year ago, there was a symposium by the Sentro ng Wikang Filipino in Diliman, hosted by Dr. Michael Andrada. He asked me to look at the names of the giant clams because that's really on my master's thesis, under the late Dr. Ed Gomez. The giant clam has several names all over, and they're all of Austronesian origin. And it depends on the habitat of the giant clam on the coral reef. So some Indonesians call it gima, okay? Depending on the particular reef zone. And in the Philippines, we're quite unusual because we call it taklobo, the giant ones. But the smaller ones belong to particular ecological zones in the coral reef are called different names in the different regions. And all of them are more or less the same all over the ethno-biodiversity, ethno-ecology names for them are more or less similar. So that would indicate possibly when the giant clam was used, whether for tools, which is quite early on in the archaeological record, and mostly for food at different times in the Pacific Islands. So it's interesting thing for research and may be connected with the population genetics of the different giant clams we have now. So I guess that could make a nice PhD topic for an interested student who wants to integrate anthropology, the marine biology, and population genetics. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Lit, have anything to add in terms of Austronesian origins?
No. I just know that somebody is working on chickens. I think I forgot the name. That's from the Institute of Animal Science.
Sorry. Speaking of chickens, so an archaeogeneticist at the Archaeological Studies program, he is working on it. His PhD dissertation in the University of Adelaide. So he actually presented about it in several conferences in UP Diliman and even in Los Baños.
That's fine. So yeah, with both chickens and actually pigs are being studied. We're using phylogeography now to look into the origins of where yung mga related breeds, because a lot of them they are from domesticated species, and they're not native to the Philippines, except probably for the chicken, which is of course derived from the jungle fowl, which is Gallus gallus or labuyo.
I remember the name now, Dr. Yebron. Jed Yebron. He delivered a seminar in the MNH one time, I think.
Yeah, but I'd like to add on dun sa taro. I think what the museum naturalists can help this with is in terms of distribution of records, because we have specimens of taro, but most of the taro we kind of focus on are wild species. There may be some specimens, of course, on the distribution of the edible taro. Kasi I think it's more of that, genuine limitation to what we call a herbarium. There is the hortorium, supposedly, where we use specimens of domesticated mga hybrids. So anything of domestication should be there. It's horticultural na yung kanyang specimen. But I think I'd forward the question to Sir Dit again. Sorry po. That would be interesting in terms of taro pests. So may mga pests associated with taro. And then you could look into that association in terms of distribution and origins towards Australasia. Would that be a good link?
Yes, I think not only pests of taro, but I'm actually looking at, pests of other domesticated crops, but also pests associated with animals and humans. For example, our lice or kuto. We can explore, for example, how molecular biogeography will reveal the association of phylogenetic relationships among the head louse that infest our indigenous peoples, as well as our, also how the ectoparasites also infest the native dogs, and even also native chickens and native pigs. So they would be interesting areas for research also.
If I remember it right, there's supposed to be a paper about the relationship of life and human evolution. It has something to do with the development of clothing.
Yes.
And for the chickens, well, he's actually just 2 doors away in this apartment. Our colleague, Dr. Michael Herrera, so he works on the archaeogenetics of chickens. I think, he delivered a talk in UP Los Baños.
Yes.
2019. last year only.
Yes.
We have a question from Lawrence Alamo. I think it could be with our entomologist. For insect taxonomy, is there any challenges for identification of elaterid beetles? I think it's the click beetles in the Philippines, or is there any ongoing research on these beetles?
Click beetles or elaterids. Like any other group of insects or terrestrial arthropods, the first challenge is, if you would like to work on them, is that many collections, especially those that have been collected during the Spanish time, during the early American period in our history, are deposited either in Germany because of early collectors. There are lots also in France, and of course, lots in the Smithsonian Institution in the US. So that's one. Many of the older collections, unfortunately, most of those specimens you may not be able to collect now with the destruction of our forests. So you have to borrow if they will lend. But most of the collections are really very accommodating as far as Filipino workers are concerned. We have a good record of borrowing and good record of returning of the specimens that we borrow. That's what we try to maintain. And then the next one is the next challenge is to learn the language. For example, many of descriptions of beetles are in German. So you have to learn another language. Now, the other challenge is how to collect in the Philippines. I think there was also a question, how do we collect, especially now that we have the COVID pandemic? Some of our colleagues who would like to return to Polillo, for example, may have been permitted by the university, but Unfortunately, the local government does not accept visitors just to preserve their zero COVID positive status. So that's one. As Dr. Dupo has mentioned about something about going forward, what do we do 10 years from now? The thing is, if you are willing, you can find a way. So if you're interested, then the first thing is to be serious about it and get enrolled in an advanced degree. Dr. Dupo is the current college secretary of the UPLB Graduate School. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, a question po. Sir, just in case that you will be allowed to do field work in areas like GCQ or MGCQ, do you already have the new normal policies for conducting field work, like protocols po?
Sige po kayo muna, sir.
I think wala pa lang, I think the DNR or other have not yet really come up with policies, updated policies, updated in terms of the new normal. I would guess that we should follow the minimum health standards of the OH and the IATF. All others, I don't know. Nothing yet.
So I'd like to add that, sir. You mentioned Iatf Guidelines. So one of the guidelines is, I don't know if it's actually restrictive or they're suggestive. Pero yung nakalagay po is avoid contact with wild animals. So in the case that affects us.
Yes. Yes.
At sa akin po medyo madali-dali kasi ang ibon po pwedeng makita through binocular. So may social distance. But for people studying mammals, for example, like bats and rodents, it would be harder because you have to trap them to study them. So there are limitations depende po dun siguro sa taxon group that you have to study. And because we are in the government, there are restrictions in terms of travel, unnecessary travel as they call it. So yun po maapekto ka ng travel. Especially now with MECQ, you can use, if your studies are outside Luzon, then you won't be able to travel kasi sarado po yung flights. At the moment during MECQ, there are limited also flights between GCQ. Depende po. Of course, if you travel for field work and you use the airports, and then you have to consider your 2-week quarantine before and after. So magdadagdag kayo dun lang. Kung ang pradaya mo ay para lang sa 10 araw, ay kulang na po ang iyong 40 days. So again, that depends.
Oh yes, I now remember, for example, the group of Dr. Cuevas would like to go on field work in Marinduque, but they are being asked by the local government to undergo the 14-day quarantine. So actually they will be spending 6 days in actual field work. You add to that the 14-day quarantine, that's 20 days. So sa number of days pa lang, ubos na yung per diem allowance, for the per diem allowance of the staff. So hindi na nila itinuloy, I think.
If I'm
for for marine biological field work, or marine science field work, we already submitted. Dr. Deo Onda and myself have submitted some potential guidelines to the National Coast Watch Center through Admiral Garcia, the former commandant of the Coast Guard. It's been collated, but they haven't really met yet to give any suggestions to the IATF. So hintayin na lang. We'll just have to wait for it. The problem nga is for marine science fieldwork is when we go to another port, each port in the country may have different regulations. No, there are some ports that require an RT-PCR test. Some would require the antibody test. So those are the difficulties that we encounter. Plus the mandatory 14-day quarantine.
Anyone else would like to add? Ma'am, may question daw po sino po yung Ma'am Cuevas yata yun?
Yes.
Ma'am Cuevas?
I would like, the mayor of Mugpog, Marinduque, actually did not permit us he said that we can go there when all the restrictions are lifted. So no travel whatsoever.
Oh,
So I think we don't have any more questions. We have, ayan po, I think that was our last one. Anyone like to add to that before we have our last question? Wala po. So I think I'll bring back to Sir Vallejo if you want to close our session.
Okay, that was a great session. We started out with Dr. Litz about the curation, educating our curators, and move on to the more cultural and the intersection of the culture, history, politics, and and colonialism in our my presentation on the Admiral Montero collection, and also Kaloy Palad's further reflections on the history and culture and philosophy that underpins the collection itself, which is not evident if we just look at the scientific aspect of it. Then we moved on to the interesting topic on culinary heritage, as you would see it through archaeological chemistry by Dr. Eusebio. And then to the science citizenship or citizen science, which presents opportunities now, greater opportunities now under the COVID-19 pandemic situation that we have in all its restrictions and this is by Dr. Dupo. And JC's safeguarding the collections during the new normal and all the difficulties and challenges and opportunities the new normal will have on us. And lastly, and that's the last topic, and of course the different questions that we got from the audience gives us new insights on how to look at all of these, especially for museums. So with that great parallel session on museums and culture and arts and indigenous knowledge, I would like to, the duty falls on me to close it. And before I close it, I'd like to thank our participants and also the presenters and the co-host JC Gonzalez. The challenges of organizing something like this during the lockdowns our learning curve was quite steep. First was to find out how to operate Zoom and how to get people talking in Zoom. But then again, we showed that we can do it, and that's great. Before I forget, there are other parallel sessions left for the PAASE 40th meeting. You can find all of those at the PAASE website, paase.org, to find out the details of these upcoming until the 14th parallel sessions on different topics. Okay, so with that, I'd like to say goodbye. JC also. JC would like to say something?
I'm sorry, just to say thank you again for the speakers and of course to our participants for joining us this morning. Thank you.
Okay, so
yeah.
Have a nice day. And
Right.
have a nice day and be safe during this pandemic. Thank you.
Salamat po.
Thank you po. Maraming
Salamat.
Salamat.